If I were going to have beer and nachos with one participant in Stalin's reign of terror, it would be Nikki Khrushchev. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. This is, of course, about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons like the SKS carbine, and why they undervalued other weapons like the Type 56 AK. Today, it's 1958. And the PLA leadership doesn't know it, but their world is about to change for the worse. Although they're not aware of it, they have been living through the PLA's golden age. If you are a PLA modernizer or professionalizer during this period, you have had a long, long leash from the Chinese Communist Party and Chairman Mao himself to build the army according to your own professional vision. The PLA is, of course, an army that has always had politics in command, as the saying goes. And no one has disputed that this is the correct way to go, but its implementation has been a matter of interpretation. And in the mid 50s, from the end of Korea all the way up until 1958, the military professionals have been allowed to do their business without what we might call political interference. That is all changing now, almost on a dime in 1958. It's going to have immediate consequences for the life of the Type 56 family, and it's going to seal the fate of the Type 63 rifle, the rifle that could have been, that would have absorbed what the PLA considered the very best features of the SKS and in a kind of Hegelian synthesis, merged them with other elements and turned it into something like the PLA's take on the AKM, their next generation service weapon that would take the place of both the rifle and the submachine gun in their arsenal, but do it in the PLA's own distinctive way. As you might know, if you're a fan of this channel, I really have great nostalgia for the Type 63, kind of the lost cause of the PLA. Well, the story that we're beginning today, the story of the political storm that shook the PLA and the rest of China starting in 1958. That is the story of why the PLA had to put the Type 63 project away, or rather, why they fumbled it badly and had to stick with the Type 56 family and convince themselves that that was actually the best for them all along. We're starting that story today at one of its well springs, which was the messy divorce between the Soviet Union and China, and quite specifically between Mao Zedong and Khrushchev. As you know, since 1955 up until now, China and the PLA have been in a rhapsodic love affair with the Soviet Union, an almost Uranian, undying friendship, and really a lot of on the ground exchange between Soviet personnel and Chinese workers and engineers and soldiers and officers. During this period, there have been about 10,000 Soviet advisors making their homes for a year or more in China, helping China get all kinds of industrialization and modernization projects off the ground. And at that level, between the Soviet advisors and the Chinese hosts, things have been going smashingly. All this while, though, things at the very top of the political pyramid have been far less rosy, and it's time today to talk about that. We've mentioned before that Mao never had what you could call a cordial relationship with Joseph Stalin. Stalin treated Mao like he was Moscow's ill-read, pet Asiatic tribal headsman. And Stalin is even quoted as calling him a cave Marxist. He was referring partly to the fact that at that point Mao was actually living in caves with his revolutionary army. But also, there was a definite implication that Mao was a primitive. Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, or I should say survived Stalin and then succeeded him, Khrushchev actually writes about this in his memoir. And by the way, I'm quoting a lot today from Khrushchev's memoirs. These are all ellipsed paraphrases. That's because that works better in a format like this when you're trying to teach people through a presentation. But you'll find the page numbers in the show notes. Khrushchev himself writes about just how condescendingly and insultingly Stalin treated Mao. And I think he had real empathy for that because Khrushchev himself had endured years of Stalin's abuse and threats and bullying. Also, Stalin was trying to use China and his other satellites as kind of third world dependencies, almost like colonies to be squeezed for the benefit of the mother country. This was Khrushchev's point of view, and it was certainly Mao's also. Mao chafed under that too. As we'll see soon, not only did not only did Stalin loot Manchuria of its industrial infrastructure, but also he kept a Soviet military presence in China on the Liaodong Peninsula that we've talked about before as a major strategic site and a place that Russia had been fighting over as a kind of colonial possession with other colonial powers, namely Japan, since back in Tsarist times. So this was literally a colonial prize in China called Port Arthur. And the USSR was just sitting on that thing for a long time, something that can only have reminded Mao and other Chinese people for a very long time they that the age, at least of the Soviet Union, sort of throwing its imperial weight around, that those days were not over. Mao was wounded by that treatment from Stalin, but he could put up with it for a purpose. And Khrushchev actually writes in his memoir about seeing Mao being deliberately obsequious to Stalin, kind of kissing up to him to try to maintain good relations with Stalin and get from Stalin as much as he could for China's benefit. Well, be that as it may, after Stalin was gone, Mao vented his resentment on Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev. Mao looked down on Khrushchev, both literally. Mao was 5'11" to Khrushchev's 5'3", so he was a head taller than Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was certainly not a cultured man. He had been a miner, and then he had been a party activist and apparatchik, and then commissar, and then party boss. The party had made a few attempts to give him some remedial schooling. That's where he met his wife, Nina. But Khrushchev was not the brains in the family. He was certainly not a well-schooled person. And he was capable of a kind of, let's say, proletarian coarseness or uncouthness. But Mao fancied himself a man of culture. Mao wrote poetry that was not bad, not bad. He was an autodidact, but he had given himself really quite a smattering of a classical education. He was a calligrapher of some note. He has quite a distinctive style. So these are all traits that are admired in the Chinese intellectual. And Mao, for a guerrilla leader, Mao had them. And finally, from Mao's perspective, Khrushchev was just a kind of jumped up yes man. He had ridden in on Stalin's coattails. He had been Stalin's party hack, and he had been enough of a survivor that he was there to take control when Stalin went kaput. That was, of course, a level of political gamesmanship and survivorship that's far beyond anything that something like I'm capable of. But Mao was pretty right to think that his own achievements had eclipsed Khrushchev. Mao, of course, hadn't conquered China on his own, but he had climbed to the top of a very large, very greasy pole, and he had knocked aside or killed or brought under his domination dozens, hundreds of very hard, very canny men. So, from Mao's perspective, he was at least Khrushchev's equal, if not quite a bit more. Sure, Khrushchev sat at the reins of the more powerful country, but in Mao's eyes, that was a temporary thing. Khrushchev, for his part, seems to have felt early on that Mao did not like him. Khrushchev writes about how even during the Sino-Soviet honeymoon, Mao created what he called an oriental atmosphere of sickly sweet politeness for the Soviets. He writes that the Chinese side was unbelievably attentive to the Soviets, but Khrushchev felt it was all insincere. Early on in that Sino-Soviet love affair, Khrushchev writes, Mao treated the Soviets like they were his soulmates. But he writes, it was all so sickly sweet that it turned your stomach. And in the fullness of time, we'll tell this story bit by bit, but in the fullness of time, Khrushchev came to think that Mao was like the second coming of Stalin. In fact, later on, he told members of his own central committee, when I look at Mao Zedong, I just see Stalin, an exact copy. Khrushchev thought he thought Mao was full of hidden agendas, that he fancied himself a sort of quasi-divine son of heaven. He thought that Mao was grotesquely naive about nuclear war and modern war in general. That Mao just did not grasp the difference between his own admittedly impressive guerrilla adventures against the KMT and the Japanese on the one hand, and the fire-breathing hell blizzard of a Wehrmacht that the Soviets had stood down. Khrushchev wrote, "We, the Soviets, graduated from a school where the course of instruction cost the lives of 20 million of our citizens. And we smashed the German army, which was a first-rate army." And then he goes on, Mao, on the other hand, took 20 or 25 years to fight his enemies. And all that time, he and they were poking each other in the butts with their bayonets and knives. We can see right here, by the way, just how little the Soviets thought of protracted warfare as a strategy. There were moments later on where Mao and Chinese military leaders said to the Soviets, like, yeah, but didn't you do that against the Germans, trade space for time? And the Soviets were just kind of agape, saying, we didn't choose to do that. That was not fun. That was nobody's first choice. That was the last ditch between us and complete perdition. It was that or genocide. So in Soviet eyes, Mao did not know what he didn't know about the reality of modern warfare, much less the Holocaust that was going to happen now if the two superpowers mixed it up in Central Europe. And Khrushchev and all the other Warsaw Pact diplomats were just dumbstruck by Mao's insouciance about getting hundreds of millions of his own citizens incinerated by nukes. In public, in private, Mao repeatedly took the position that we, China, have 600 million citizens. If 300 million of them get nuked to dust, well, we can still come out of the ashes and then replace our population. That's why I'm not afraid, Mao said, of nuclear warfare. It's a paper tiger. Khrushchev never was completely certain whether Mao was just trolling him, but all over the Beijing diplomatic circuit, we've got Czech and Polish diplomats and Soviet ones talking at receptions and dinner parties about whether Mao was really crazy and absolutely not fazed by the threat of nuclear war, or whether this was all some very, very deep propaganda ploy. So this didn't please the ears of anybody in the Soviet bloc, but Khrushchev in particular was trying to turn to a kinder, gentler communism, relatively speaking, after the prolonged terror and suffering of Stalin's reign. Domestically, Khrushchev wanted to improve people's standard of living in the Soviet Union. Housing was a priority for him. The Soviet Russia and the whole communist world, including China, are still full of these Spartan but adequate buildings called Khrushchevka. In Chinese, they call them Danyuanlou. And you don't just see them in Russia or China, you also see them in the former DDR, East Germany, in Hungary. Wherever Soviet advisors went in the mid 20th century, you find those Khrushchevka buildings. And I actually quite like them. Khrushchev was trying to get the population more and better food, always an Achilles heel for the Soviet Union. And when the conversation would turn with people like Mao, who were like more old style Stalinist hardliners, emphasizing heavy industry, military preparedness, and world revolution, Khrushchev would say these kind of cool Yogi Berra aphorisms like, well, if we promise people nothing better than just revolution, aren't they going to scratch their heads and say, isn't it better to have good goulash? Khrushchev sounds like he was a pretty funny guy, kind of charming, at least by the standards of a former Stalin henchperson. And he used that throughout Soviet diplomacy to try to kind of win friends, influence people, do kind of a Dale Carnegie thing. And he was, with the United States in particular, he was looking to lower the temperature and settle into a long-term peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev still believed that history lay with socialism and eventual communism, but he now knew this was not going to happen overnight. And he figured that given enough time, the capitalist world would see the growing splendor and abundance and richness of the socialist world, and that they would, in effect, go socialist voluntarily. In another of his funny, folksy sayings, Khrushchev once said, if you can't catch a bird of paradise, it's better to take a wet hen. He still believed in the classless society one day, but he wasn't going to go hell for leather and kill people to get there.
Well, not many people.
He sounds like a pretty charming guy. He sounds kind of like an earthy communist Ronald Reagan, just less telegenic. But if I were going to have beer and nachos with one participant in Stalin's reign of terror, it would be Nikki Khrushchev. I'm positively certain that Khrushchev saw and did some things in his younger days. But at the very least, Khrushchev was a very human leader. When he traveled to the US and China and met with Eisenhower and Mao, he took Mrs. Khrushchev along. She was the Soviet Union's first lady. Because, Lenin didn't tour world capitals in evening wear with his lady on his arm. And Stalin, no. Stalin, too, did not put his marriage or his private life on display. This was yet another thing that Khrushchev did to humanize himself. In fact, there's a very funny but kind of cruel joke about poor Mrs. Khrushchev, who just seems like such a little sweetie. But there's a story, probably apocryphal, that someone somewhere was interviewed after the Kennedy assassination and asked, how do you think the fallout in world politics would have been different if it had been Khrushchev who was assassinated instead of President Kennedy? And in one telling of this, it was Khrushchev himself who said, well, I don't think that Aristotle Onassis would have married Mrs. Khrushchev. She didn't rock a pink pillbox hat quite as well as Jackie Kennedy. I think that story is apocryphal because it's been attributed to, I mean, good Lord, Gore Vidal, Zhou Enlai, a Soviet task reporter, even to Mao Zedong himself. At some point in the 80s, there was a complete jaboni of a US government representative who repeated this joke where he attributes the quote to Mao Zedong and he did like this Ching Chong accent, like,
All right, on reflection, I'm not doing the accent. This post is going to get flamed enough.
believe it or not, his Chinese interlocutors were offended. Always sending their top aces to China. Anyway, part of Khrushchev's agenda was he also wanted to light up on the Soviet Union's satellite states. One of Khrushchev's gripes about Stalin was that Stalin had treated the satellite states basically like they were banana republics, sort of colonial dependencies whose economies and trade the Soviet Union weighed on heavily to benefit itself rather than those countries themselves. But of course, that was not Khrushchev's only gripe about Stalin. Oh boy, how do we know? Because in 1956, Khrushchev shocked the world by giving a speech at a party congress where he denounced Stalin, denounced him for calumniating, torturing, and killing party members, for mass deportations of whole ethnicities, and for finding plots where none existed. This speech was a
Bomb.
in the socialist world. There are lots of stories about like delegates being so shocked by this level of heresy. I mean, any one of which would have gotten a person shot practically on the spot in Stalin's days. That the stories say there were delegates hearing this speech who like fainted or became so ill that they had to be carried bodily out of the hall. Supposedly, the Secretary General of the Polish Communist Party had a heart attack and died while he was reading the speech. And although on the one hand, Khrushchev meant this this denunciation of Stalin as like the dawn of a new and better day in a kinder, gentler Soviet bloc, this caused tons of trouble for other countries' communist parties too. In the United States, it killed the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, and it decimated other Western European communist parties. Nowadays, American intellectuals in particular don't appreciate just how very red the American and European intelligentsias were between the wars. Well, this dealt a terrible blow to those Western countries' communist parties. In Poland, this thaw gave a green light for anti-Soviet demonstrations and riots. And Hungary actually rebelled and tried to secede from the Warsaw Pact, taking advantage of Khrushchev's thaw. But the Soviets were not about to go that far and let that happen. So they ended up invading Budapest, and lots of people died to bring Hungary back under Soviet imperium. Well, Mao in particular did not appreciate this sudden rug pull from Khrushchev. Mao had invested a lot in following Stalin's lead, connecting himself with Stalin in the public eye, refashioning his government along Stalinist lines, and he certainly didn't need any disaffected Chinese people contemplating whether they should throw their own Budapest uprising or start giving secret speeches about Mao himself. And above all, Mao did not need the home office of world communism tarnishing the communist brand. You can see how, from Mao's perspective, that was a really dirty move. I mean, imagine that you're an upstart businessman in a faraway land with a very underdeveloped economy, and you dream big of one day bringing McDonald's to your homeland, the first one. And so you spend 30 years saving money, struggling, bayoneting people, so that you can buy the first ever McDonald's franchise in your country. And then right after that, the chairman of McDonald's holds a press conference where he trashes McDonald's history of abuse and depredations, and he launches a 4-hour Jeremiad about the poor nutritional content of McDonald's food. That would not be cool. This joker would have gone and just undercut your decades of investment in an investment that thousands and thousands of people had died for political reasons of his own, without so much as a consultation, without saying, hey, heads up, you might need to think hard about your own political survival. So this may be a good example of how there were many things that Khrushchev and the Soviets thought were like perfectly good and even quite generous on their part, that the Chinese, as the dependent party in the relationship, still just had cause to resent. Khrushchev knew that Mao didn't like him. He knew that Mao didn't like his de-Stalinization program. And he understood, or at least he thought he understood, the Chinese sensitivity to anything that smacked of imperialism, whether overt or covert, whether by a Western power or a communist power. He thought he fully appreciated this, and he was working overtime at the beginning to try to make it up to Mao. And he thought he could do it. Like, for a while at least, he had succeeded in being conciliatory with Yugoslavia and cleaning up the relationship between Tito, the Yugoslav leader who legitimately told Stalin where to stick his pipe, and the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev was trying to make friends in Asia and Africa for the Soviet Union. And so he tried to apply this same treatment to Mao, but it did not work. First, he found, kind of to his confusion, that Mao felt that when it came to the United States and Khrushchev's overtures for peaceful coexistence, which Mao denounced as bourgeois pacifism, Mao felt that Khrushchev was being a squish, that he was wimping out on world revolution and basically trying to settle into uh, something like bourgeois comfort with the United States instead of continuing to grind against imperialism. He thought, in effect, that Khrushchev and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had kind of like been bought off. Like they'd achieved enough revolution, and now they were going to sit pretty with a sort of mutual understanding with the United States and kind of like pull up the ladder after them. Philosophically, Mao was opposed to that. He was a radical revolutionary who really believed in world revolution as fast as possible, literally bursting with an impatient desire for world revolution, as Khrushchev wrote. And also, it wasn't lost on him that if the US and the USSR made nice and basically divided up the world between them, there was not going to be a big geopolitical place for China. So, if Khrushchev was not willing to carry the sword for world revolution, Mao was quite happy to do that. This was maybe step one in helping to revive bad memories in Khrushchev's mind of the excesses and the bloodletting and the chaos of the early Bolshevik days. Also, Khrushchev had just gotten done denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and rocking a lot of boats by doing that. And he now thought that he saw the beginnings of Mao's own cult of personality. Khrushchev wrote at one point that Mao thought of himself as of divine origin. Also, Mao was in a big rush to realize textbook communism, where they would do away with bourgeois notions that people should only get as much as they gave. And Mao was pushing hard to adopt quasi-militarized communes, where they would take one giant step or one great leap forward, as he called it, toward implementing real communism. More on that in a moment. But first, remember that even Stalin, much less Khrushchev, looked on earlier Bolshevik mad dashes toward crash industrialization and utopian communalization with bad memories of the disasters that they'd created. And they really toned down their expectations to a more mature, circumspect level. But Mao, for his part, was still thinking something like real communism hasn't been tried. This had some calamitous effects. Starting in 1958, Mao launched what he called his Great Leap Forward, which was a crash industrialization and agricultural communalization plan. In agriculture, it had terrible effects. It created an enormous man-made famine. And in industry, the results were even more bizarre. I'll let Khrushchev describe it. He describes Chinese engineers being pressured to throw away scientifically derived specs and tolerances for their machinery because the Chinese ideologues just declared that specs and tolerances, those are just bourgeois inventions. There was this magical thinking that they could just ignore some of the limits of material science, say. And so Khrushchev continues that it placed excessive strain on their machinery because it was out of spec. The machinery would wear out. That, happening on a vast scale, then created general disorganization of industry and anarchy. Shortages of raw material appeared, equipment was ruined. Engineers who stuck to the technological standards based on scientific knowledge were accused of being yes men for the bourgeoisie, wreckers, that is to say, saboteurs, and so forth. Of course, one of the first places that this began to cause obvious ruination was engineering and manufacturing. The agricultural consequences took longer to make themselves known because the crop cycle is longer and it's easy to lie and get away with it about some of those facts. But machinery is less forgiving. And so Khrushchev writes that I think it was Zhou Enlai appealed to Moscow for help, saying, our manufacturing sector is going wonky, and we need some expert help. And so the Soviets flew out their top metallurgy guy, and the metallurgy guy went over and he made a tour of Chinese heavy industry. And then he came back to Moscow and he said, okay, well, I think I found their problem. First, their metallurgy is now being run by some rando who's trained as a veterinarian. Second, all their real metallurgists, they have been sent to rural hellholes for political re-education. Khrushchev got alarmed. He had seen this horror film before, and he had sat at the right hand of Stalin when scientists and engineers were purged if they told truths that the politicos didn't want to hear. And he figured, to paraphrase something from earlier in this course, ethos over arms might be a thing, but there's no such thing as ethos over physics or chemistry or biology. The most infamous feature of this were the backyard furnaces. Chinese people were pressed to quote unquote manufacture steel or pig iron by just taking metal implements from their homes and just dumping them into great big homemade kilns to sort of like melt them down into blobs, big ingots of industrially useless metal junk. And in that way, they ended up junking important, productive, useful tools, bicycles, cooking implements, farming tools, and machines. And in China, people on the ground were lying to Beijing about how much food they'd grown or machinery they'd produced with these miraculous new politically inspired methods because they were afraid to tell the truth about what a disaster it was. So in Beijing, it took a long time for leaders to slowly learn and then accept that, in fact, they were not living through an unforetold economic boom, but that they had just sowed the seeds of the death of roughly 30 million of their own citizens. That number is very hard to tabulate, but most scholarly estimates hover in the 30 millions. That's, let's see now, I think that's 5% of China's population died of starvation and malnutrition, and in some cases of political beatings. That temporarily made Mao's star dip, but not for all that long. Well, interestingly, Khrushchev actually writes that during the early phases of the Great Leap Forward, when China was still trumpeting these amazing new economic achievements before it became clear that this was actually a calamity, and speaking of the economy, the Soviet Union would sometimes roll its eyes at what it considered the Chinese side's sometimes whiny sense of entitlement. From their perspective, they, the Soviet Union, were being very generous with China. They were spending 7% of their national income. I'm not sure if that's GNP, GDP, but 7% of something really big on aid to China. So, from their perspective, they were losing a lot of money to help China. Khrushchev writes that the IP for those tech transfers, the technical documentation, and that would include the technical packages for the Type 56 family, those were a free gift. Now, there were things that China paid for, and from the Chinese perspective, they were paying through the nose to the Soviet Union for military and other technology that wasn't the very most up to date. This could sometimes bother them very much that they weren't getting the best that the Soviets had to offer. But Khrushchev, in his memoirs, he gripes about how not just China, but other countries in the USSR's sphere would come pleading to him for aid. And so, out of a sense of magnanimity and obligation, the Soviet Union, he wrote, would provide aid that it couldn't really afford. And he wrote, the Soviets would eventually get paid back, but sometimes in goods that they didn't really need or want. So the Soviets would send industrial machinery and get repaid in some commodity, like, I'm just pulling this out of the air, like Cuban sugar, maybe, that was nice to have, but that they could live without. So this would be like if I talked you into helping me out by selling me your used truck, and I don't have money to pay you, but I'm like, hey, I do have a lifetime supply of adult diapers, and I'll give them to you. And I'll make up the difference by giving you free Reiki treatments. Then it will all be fair and square. You can see how maybe you wouldn't be fully satisfied with that arrangement, but might still go along with it to help me out. And maybe you would think of it as like kind of helping me save face, kind of giving charity, but in a way where we didn't have to admit to each other that that's really what was happening. So this kind of dynamic is perfectly familiar now from development economics, and you can see how both sides would feel, with some justification, resentful of the other. And both sides could both feel magnanimity or appreciation, but also at the same time feel that there was some chiseling happening or some unbecoming sense of entitlement. I'm sure that's very hard to avoid. And we're going to see all of this again played out in reverse in China's relationship with Vietnam. So Khrushchev felt that China was being ungrateful for Soviet assistance. Intellectually, he understood that China had been through a lot with imperial powers, including Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev did not get the emotions involved. So as the relationship between Khrushchev and Mao devolved, more and more, Khrushchev was getting mad that China wasn't showing its appreciation properly. For example, he writes about how at one point China ended up with a captured Sidewinder missile when that was new from an aerial missile fight with the KMT Air Force. They ended up with a US Sidewinder that hadn't exploded, and the Soviets wanted the Sidewinder to study it and reverse engineer it. And the Chinese at first would not give it to them. They wanted to do it themselves. And eventually the Soviets wheedled it out of the Chinese, but this left a bad taste in Khrushchev's mouth. As far as he was concerned, quite naively, I would say, it was simply more efficient for the Chinese to give it to the Soviets. And of course, the Soviets were the fraternal brothers of the Chinese Communist Party. Naturally, they would share whatever they learned with China. But of course, Mao and the Chinese military leaders, they were not fools. They understood that ultimately the Soviet Union was for the Soviet Union, that they couldn't simply rely forever on Soviet largesse and assistance, and they were eager to kick free of dependence on Soviet military technology as early as possible. And Khrushchev clearly did not get that. He was believing too much of his own propaganda, and I would say wearing a kind of a blindingly white hat. He meant well, but he was naive. Then Khrushchev got really weirded out by what he believed were Mao's designs on the Soviet Far East. The two countries had borders that China disputed. There had been border treaties signed in Tsarist times. China was now coming back and wanting to renegotiate those because it said that those treaties were signed under undue pressure when Russia had the advantage over China. And Khrushchev took the position that, look, we can't go back to arbitrary points and rewrite history and renegotiate all the deals that were worked out on that basis. Let's just do some swaps. Like, for example, Khrushchev gave back the Soviet naval base at Port Arthur in exchange for the PRCs recognizing Mongolian independence. But the Chinese didn't simply drop the disputed border issue. And over time, Khrushchev came to believe that Mao was hinting to him that maybe China would take over the underpopulated Soviet Far East and Siberia. Now, if this sounds weird or paranoid, let's steelman Khrushchev's perceptions. Mao was openly nationalist, and that alone weirded out Khrushchev. In the communist ideology of that day, you still at least had to pay lip service to the ideal of world communism and internationalism. And if you sounded openly, frankly nationalist, you sounded like a Marxist heretic. Now, Khrushchev was aware that Mao actually was a Marxist heretic. Mao's understanding of Marxism did not bear a strong resemblance to Marx as he was understood in Moscow. And though this is a subject for another day, Mao as a thinker had much more in common with traditional Chinese thought and philosophy than anything else.
Very quick, fun tangent.
Khrushchev writes that because Mao fancied himself a philosopher, Stalin sent him an ambassador, Pavel Yudin, who was a Soviet Marxist philosopher. So Stalin sent Yudin over to just keep Mao occupied and entertained talking about philosophy. And Khrushchev writes that Stalin's attitude was basically like, do whatever you have to comfort the child, just whatever, so long as it doesn't cry. One more indication from Khrushchev that Stalin patronized Mao, that he saw him as this puerile, lightweight Oriental despot who needn't be taken seriously. Just send a philosopher to keep him entertained and busy with his little castles in the air. Khrushchev also writes about this amazement that he had at Mao treating him to what he felt were these very tasteless, even aggressive expatiations of nationalist braggadocio, boasting and bombastic praises for China's own past achievements. And Khrushchev interpreted these as more indications that Mao had aspirations toward territorial expansion at Soviet expense. Now, I have to be honest, when I read these things, they are so milquetoast and totally familiar. Everything that Khrushchev writes about Mao's supposedly shocking nationalist bombast. I mean, I've heard these things, no joke, 1,000 times each. There is nothing about these that are unique to Mao, fresh, exciting. They're just face-peelingly boring after a time. 中国5000年悠久的历史，入侵的胡族毕竟都被汉化。 打不过的，他就吸收、消化、汉化，很聪明。这就是中国人传统的智慧，别的民族都比不上。这就是中国人为什么在世界上牛逼。Go to a public park, play chess with somebody, ride a bus, chat people up. You will hear this stuff all day. There is nothing surprising about it. It's completely unexceptional. Now, granted, Khrushchev had other reasons for thinking as he did, and he had long conversations with Mao, and he had lots of reports from Soviet diplomatic and intelligence channels. Fine. I'm just saying that this particular kind of diatribe is utterly standard. You can hear variations of it in most any country. This, as far as I'm concerned, is not a strong data point in favor of establishing Mao's desire for world conquest or expansion into Soviet territory. But be that as it may, Khrushchev came to fear that Mao wanted to gobble up Siberia, which was very valuable to the Soviets for its resources, but only lightly populated and therefore lightly defended. And speaking of defense, Khrushchev really drove Mao and the Chinese leaders bananas through these repeated overtures to try to get China to join the Soviets in a joint defense agreement. Now, from Khrushchev's perspective, he was just being a good guy by trying to build like joint comms facilities and joint naval bases on Chinese territory that would host both Chinese and Soviet forces for their mutual benefit and protect the socialist world from their common enemies. But from the Chinese perspective, this was yet another invitation into an inevitably unequal relationship with the Soviets, where the Soviets would call the shots and the Chinese would be the junior partners. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, this was just as good as becoming one more Soviet satellite. This is perfectly understandable, but they reacted with shocking ferocity from the Soviet perspective. The Soviets were completely taken aback by just the splenetic response from Mao, as if they had said something very insulting to him. And this really accelerated the decline of the relationship. Now, the relationship between Mao and Khrushchev went from being one of dislike but civility to just becoming increasingly openly catty and childish. Khrushchev was brought to Beijing and snubbed. Mao insisted on having a kind of summit with Khrushchev in Mao's swimming pool. Mao loved to swim. He was really good at it. Khrushchev couldn't swim, and so the witnesses to that say it was just like this sort of embarrassing, pathetic affair where like Mao is just sort of like swimming leisurely, trying to conduct talks about great affairs of state, while poor Khrushchev, who can't swim, is like reduced to like floating with like water wings or like some sort of basically a floaty toy. And Mao wasn't like Sean Connery, but by the standards of Cold War world socialist leaders, he was a sort of healthy, vibrant, pretty good-looking guy. Not Hugh Jackman, but also not Danny DeVito. But Khrushchev was this chubby, stumpy little ex-miner who I think didn't really have a beach body exactly. And everybody who is involved, the Soviets and the Chinese, all interpreted this as a massive slight to Khrushchev, meant to make him look and feel small and belittled. It was a flex on Mao's part. At this point, if not before, Khrushchev's mask just really started to slip. And he stopped trying anymore with Mao. And more behind closed doors, it became Soviet opinion that Mao was a dangerously loose cannon. Although they had promised to help him build a nuclear weapons program in very short order, now they backtracked fast from that. The Soviet interpretation of Mao was he had this quasi-mystical belief in the power of the mobilized masses and guerrilla warfare, that the human spirit is the decisive factor in war and not weapons, and certainly not nukes, and a romantic fascination with the idea that even a weak and backward country could wear down an advanced country in prolonged attritional warfare through sheer perseverance. Wow, that was naive, wasn't it? But this was not a thing that the Soviet Union had any interest in supporting or encouraging. So they suddenly withdrew their nuclear help. And by 1960, the Soviet Union just withdrew all of its Soviet experts from China practically overnight. I mean, people could certainly have seen the writing on the wall. By this point, uh, Soviet and Chinese delegations were behaving abominably in public at international socialist gatherings. Nobody was even trying to hide the cattiness anymore. But it was in 1960 that the split became final and, as we'll see later, violent. In our next episode, we're going to go back to what turmoil this caused within the leadership of the PLA, which instantly was ripped in two. That had immediate consequences for military doctrine and strategy, and that had immediate consequences for small arms procurement and the kind of competition that was unfolding between the Type 56 family and the
Type 63.
Until then, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might consider visiting our Patreon page, but this course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. This is Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'll see you next time, and I cannot wait for it.